I'm Eva, and I am here to unpack my knitting basket as I do every week these days. You can find me as The Charm of It on Ravelry and Instagram and on my blog, which is wordpress.com. And I'm here with Thistle, and Moth is making her way down the cat tree. There she is. Once again, I've got stuff on her space, so she's not terribly impressed. Anyway, and I would just like to take a moment to thank you if you're tuning in for the first time for giving me a try. And if you're returning, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. And when I first started recording these, I found it a little awkward to talk about. But really, I do this in order to connect with people. And so obviously, the people who take the time out of their day to leave comments anywhere really, YouTube, the blog, Instagram, and those who join the Ravelry group and have really started to send messages or just chat with me on the threads there. That's great. That's why I'm doing this. So I just wanted to take a moment to thank all of you who do that. I watch quite a few podcasts, and I tend to use them as my downtime for relaxing, so I don't usually end up going to Ravelry and interacting with the podcast hosts. So I'm not, I just wanted to say thank you to those who do take the time. And before I started doing my own podcast, the other reason why I wouldn't want to get in touch with hosts is because it felt like it would just kind of annoy them, almost like, paparazzi with celebrities or something. I don't know. That was in my brain. But now that I'm doing one of my own, I realize that far from being annoyed, I am tickled and pleased and very highly motivated by everyone who leaves comments and chats with me about knitting, because there we go. Okay, so let's talk about my knitting this week. I am using my regular camera again because the consensus seemed to be that the quality was a lot better. And I think that I'll be better about transitions this week because I understand a little more what I'm doing. I've played with the focus a bit. I am still going to have to merge clips together, but I will do that in a way that is more seamless than last time, we'll hope. And I think it's worth it to see the knitting better. I feel like there was one more thing I was going to say about that. Oh, let me know if you don't think it's worth it. I think that was it. Okay, so, oh yeah, I have an outline this time. I remembered to write it. So, I think we'll go straight into finished objects because the question I was asked is about yarn, and that's big enough to be its own topic, and I don't want to have to worry about time crunch there. So, I have a few finished objects this week. First up is the Woodsman hat, which is a Christmas gift from my dad. It's knit out of Quince & Company's Owl Tweet, which is 50% wool, 50% alpaca, woolen spun. It's a worsted weight. It's made in the US, but I believe the alpaca is from New Zealand because Quince & Company couldn't source enough high quality alpaca here in the US. Anyway, so I made my dad mittens earlier this year, and I wanted to make him a matching hat. I used the Riveroni pattern, which is a free Ravelry one, and I chose it because it had these really fun decreases at the crown. I haven't decreased much in ribbing, and lately I've become more interested in increases and decreases and how you can play with your knitting via them and create different kinds of fabric. So I wanted to try this out. As you can tell, it's not quite finished, and that is because I wanted to do it long enough to have a doubled brim, but I'm going to wait until I give it to my dad so he can decide exactly what length he wants it at, and I will just sew it at that length. And my head is fairly big. It's like 22 and a half inches, and according to my handy book of patterns by Ann Budd, a men's large is 23 inches. And this easily fits me with lots of room to spare. So, yeah, ribbing is pretty awesome. Oh, caught on the bobby pin. Okay. And then I've kind of slowed down on the Christmas knitting. I lost a bit of mojo, so I decided to just give myself a break rather than force myself to do it. Knitting is a hobby and something I do for fun, and so I don't like it to feel like a responsibility. I'm gonna take a quick sip. I am drinking the lavender, Earl Grey, and Ceylon mix again today. Okay. Oh, and then the other thing I wanted to say about this hat real quickly is that I tend to knit more elaborate patterns because I'm a details person, and I see all of the amazing things I can do with knitting, and I want to do it all. And so this hat is one of the more simpler things I've knit, and it really reminded me that simplicity is very valuable as well. Quite a few of the clothes I wear are more simple. Well, okay, but then I like add brooches and decorative things to them. Anyway, so it's just a good reminder that not everything has to be super complex, and you know, sometimes the simpler things are the most wearable. My dad is a very man's man, you know, 30 years in the military, and his dad was in the military too, so that kind of culture, so nothing frilly for him. Okay, so since I had time to devote to my own projects, I managed to finish my Marsipan socks. These are, sorry Thistle, we gotta get closer. Okay, I'll do this one. Let's see. Okay, so these are with the Pointel pattern by Cookie A. It is not a free pattern. It is from her Knit Sock Love book, which I got from my library. And it's a really fun mix of lace and then really clever decreases that add these cool diagonal stripes. I made it out of Quince & Company's Finch, which is their fingering yarn. I find it's very good for socks, even though it's not super washed, because it's really tightly spun. I have one or two other pairs in it, and they've worn really well. And it's their Audouin colorway, which is the lighter of their heathers. So there's actually a giant mistake in the right sock, which is the first one I knit, and I didn't realize it until I knit the left sock. So let me show you. You see how on this side everything's straight and lined up. On this sock, not so much. And I know what happened. I woke up at like 5 one morning and I couldn't fall back asleep, so I decided to just watch some PBS Masterpiece, Wolf Hall, and knit. And I was knitting and I noticed I don't weave in the ends on socks until I'm done with them. And I noticed that the dangling end was not at the end of the needle. And I thought, oh my gosh, I've gone off somewhere. So I looked at it and I read my knitting and I readjusted and I moved the stitches around, and then I started at where I thought I should be with the row. But then once I started knitting the left sock, I realized that because of the way the pattern is worked and these decreases, which happen right on the edges of the needles, the beginning of the round does move, and so the yarn tail isn't going to be at the end of the first needle because you've moved it around. So that's what happened basically, and I didn't notice it when I was knitting the first sock because I guess I just, I didn't know how the pattern was going to lay out, and so I didn't realize that it wasn't supposed to be looking the way that it was. And you can also see it on the back. The difference. So I was fully prepared to basically cut the right sock off above where I went wrong and reknit it. But then I tried them on and I really loved them, and the mistake didn't bother me. I refer to myself as a recovering perfectionist because I feel like when I was younger, my perfectionist tendencies kept me from doing things that I wasn't good at right away because I just couldn't handle not being able to meet very high standards right from the beginning. And luckily I've kind of outgrown that as I've gotten older. It took some work, but I'm there. But when I'm knitting, I'm happy to just, if I find a mistake, I'll pull back and fix it instead of saying, oh, I can live with that, because usually I would rather just spend the extra time because I'm going to spend a lot more time wearing whatever I'm knitting than even the process of frogging and reknitting it does. So I expected to want to do that with these, but I tried them on and I really loved them just the way they are, and they kind of make me smile with their quirky mistake, and so I'm just going to leave them as they are. If the right sock ends up annoying me, I have about half a skein left over, and of course I can unravel it, because to fix it, it's a top-down sock. So to fix it, I would have to go back to here and reknit all of that. And I will certainly do that if I feel like it, but so far I've already worn them and I've gotten a lot of pleasure out of them just the way that they are. So that was an interesting lesson for me. And I've really fallen in love with this color. When it first arrived in the mail, I wasn't so sure on it. It looked a little dingy in the skein, but knit up, I'm just really loving it. It's almost like a grayed cream color. And I don't know, I feel like it makes a really good match for these socks, and I would love to have a kind of Quantel inspired sweater in this colorway as well. And this is my first Cookie A pattern, and it has made me want to knit all of her things. I just found it so interesting and clever watching the way that she manipulated decreases to do what she wanted. So yeah, very rounded toe because I've got peasant feet, and that's that. I'm going to have to take a break, but you should not notice it because I'm not going to spend 20 seconds staring at the camera saying, okay now. So then I'll talk about my final finished object of the week, which I am super excited about. So the last thing I finished is the beret that I was knitting for the Art History Craft Along, which was sponsored by M of the Knitting Pretty podcast, which is an audio podcast that I absolutely love. If you look it up in iTunes, it shows as, it's got an explicit rating, and I think she did that because she occasionally has a mild swear word, but I don't notice it, so don't let that scare you off. It's very normal. It's just people talk, Oh, Thistle just knocked over some of my notes. Anyway, I highly recommend that you give her audio podcast a try if you have not. Okay, so now that Thistle has knocked all my notes to the ground, but she's comfy, that's what matters. So, she chose various works of art throughout history, and then participants could pick one and knit something that had something to do with that. And one of the things she picked was Gothic cathedrals. I think it was the Rheims Cathedral. And so I decided that that would be a really fun way to use my Quince & Company Piper for a hat. And, excuse me. And then I decided it would be even more fun to design my own hat. So Piper is a lace weight. It's a heavy lace weight yarn. It's 50% merino, 50% mohair, all from Texan animals. And I used the Abilene colorway, which I got off D-Stash. So, as you know, if you've been following my podcast before, first I knit the brim on 000s, and I knit it with this beautiful oak leaf pattern, and that is because a lot of Gothic cathedrals, there's a lot of decorative stonework, and a lot of those friezes are like stylized nature, so there's a lot of stylized leaves and that kind of thing. So I thought that that would be a very nice homage, plus I just love leaves. So I knit the brim, and that took a really long time, and then I grafted it together, and then I picked up and started doing the hat. And if you saw last time, I think I talked about this, I did arches, because of course you can't have Gothic architecture without arches. And then I did these pretty little pattern I found from my Twisted Stitch knitting book, because the diamond pattern reminded me of Gothic cathedrals as well. So I had a really good time knitting the body, and then I got to the crown decreases, and I think I was inspired by, watching the Cookie A pattern and how that developed, and so I decided that I really wanted the decreases to I wanted the 3 arches to go down to 1 arch, and then I wanted all of the Twisted Stitch panels to meet in a cross. And I totally didn't expect to be able to do this the first time, so I put in dental floss as a lifeline so that if I needed to rip back, I wouldn't have to pick up a bunch of stitches. And then I started, but I got it the first time. I'm so pleased. So here's the decreases for the arches, and they still look pretty arch-like. And then here is the crown. So there's the Twisted Stitch cross, and yeah, I finished this on the evening of a day that was quite difficult and had a lot of kind of stress, and I wasn't feeling very great about my skills at life in general. So to have this work out was it was such a boost. So then I blocked it. Oh, look at that cross. Okay, so I blocked it. I don't tend to block lace super aggressively because I like it when the fabric is still a bit bouncy. So I just blocked it to like a moderate beret, and it is ready for wearing. We've had a very mild winter so far. It's been in the 40s and 50s this past week, which is what, 5 to 10 Celsius. So a lace weight hat should be perfect, but I bet this will be warm even when it drops below freezing, because the brim is very, very dense since I knit it on size 0s. And then the fabric isn't super open, and mohair is very warm to begin with. So that is my final finished object of the week, and I could not be happier with it. It took less than a skein, actually. It took, I think, 3/4 of a skein. And I got 4 skeins off of the D-stash, so I've got plenty left over for a shawl. And I've decided that rather than originally I was going to do a lace stole and it's like 900 something yards for that. But I've noticed when I'm knitting neckwear that I tend to really like both the process and the finished objects of the neckwear I make in heavier yarns. So I'm going to hold the yarn together. So it'll be more of a sport weight, so I'll hold it doubled. And so I was looking at various shawls that call for around 450 yards. And I have found one that I'm very excited about. It's called Mustard Seed, after one of the fairies in Midsummer Night's Dream, which is definitely one of my favorite Shakespeare plays. Moth's name is partly inspired by that. That's another one of the fairies. And it's a crescent shape, which I think I found is easier for me to wear, but it's also got points from the way you block it, and so it'll give me a little bit of an idea about whether triangle shawls or something, that I should be going for. And it's got beading, so that will be new for me, and I just think it's absolutely beautiful. So I put it in my queue. I haven't bought the pattern yet because I don't like to buy patterns until I'm going to cast on, but I am very, very excited about that. And I started watching the video podcast Tiny Paper Foxes this past week, and I got really into it. I really enjoyed Jenny's knitting style and her philosophies, and it's a beautifully done podcast. The production values are really high, so it was just really fun to watch. And she wears a bunch of really big shawls, and so that inspired me to try another one, because as you know, I'm a newbie to shawls. So, but it would be fun to make them part of my wardrobe, because they tend to take me a bit longer to knit, so you get more value for knitwear. Okay, works in progress. We will talk about the simplest one first. I'm almost done with my Christmas knitting. So this is the Oktoberfest beanie, which I'm knitting for my brother-in-law, who is very into beer. And I have never knit him anything before, just because he's not a big gift person or hand knit person, but then I saw this beer chart for stranded knitting, and I knew that it would be perfect. I'm knitting it in Quince & Company's Finch because he lives in South Texas, so the lighter weight will be fine. And the reason why it's on waste yarn instead of a circular needle is because, so I did all the ribbing and I did the color work, and I asked Instagrammers if it was too orange, and we all decided that it looked good. Apparently he's made some batches of pumpkin ale too. But then I was afraid it was going to be too small, so I blocked it out to see, because when I was trying it on the needles, it felt a little tight. But now that I've blocked it, I think it'll be good, because we've still got some stretch. I think my brother-in-law and my dad probably have about the same size head, a men's large, so an inch more than mine. And I really wanted this to look more like something you would find in a store. I really enjoy wearing more artsy clothes, but to appeal to my brother-in-law, I think it should look a little more store-bought. So I'm just doing the one row of pint glasses, and then the rest of it will just be plain knitting. This is the Sabine colorway, which is their darkest gray heather. So it's almost a black, but a more interesting black, and I think it'll look really nice on my brother-in-law. And then the orange is their new Fox colorway. And for the foam, I decided to use some Shetland wool, because it's woolen spun instead of worsted, so it's a little bit fluffier, and I thought it would look more foam-like. So I'm really pleased with how that turned out, and the rest of the knitting will just be plain stockinette, which I love because I can do it while I'm reading. And that is most of my Christmas list done. So, feeling quite accomplished. I've also been working since I finished my Marsipan socks. Of course, I cast on a new pair, and the Solid Socks group is doing a theme. They're inspired by deserts, like this month, and I'm not a big desert person, but I do love the Silk Road, and so I wanted to knit a pair of socks that reminded me of caravans and the caravanserai, which were the inns that they stopped at. And I happened to find a free pattern on Ravelry called Twisted Mockery, which is it was a mystery knit along for the other socks group I'm a part of, Sock Knitters Anonymous, and their December theme is mystery knit alongs you missed. So for the first time I will be double dipping. It worked out well. And I've just finished the leg on the first one. This is out of Barocco, come on camera, there we go. Barocco Ultra Alpaca Fine, there we go. And it is the Tiger's Eye colorway, which is a really beautiful kind of harvest gold color that I cannot wear near my face, but I think it'll be fine on my feet. And as you can see, there's twisted stitch pattern on the front. I love twisted stitches, I think they're so fun. And then the back is mainly just 1x1 twisted ribbing, and then there's a little bit of decoration at the end. So I'm just about ready to start the heel flap, and I know it looks really small, but it's super stretchy, and that has been going well. And I have one more work in progress to tell you about, but I'm going to take a sip first. Oops, sorry, every time I bend over, huh? I'll take a sip of tea, and then we can get to talking about that because it is much bigger than I expected it to be. So last week I showed you the new sweater I started. I don't know if I mentioned it, but I'm calling it the Thistle Down sweater because it's got a thistle cable on it and it's soft, and there we go. So when I showed it to you last week, I had done the bottom in about 4 inches, but it looked like my gauge was off. So I blocked it and my gauge was off. I think what happened is, when I'm knitting Continental right now, I'm wrapping the yarn either 2 or 3 times around my pointer finger, depending on what kind of fabric I want. And when I was swatching, I must have wrapped it 3 times, and then I just forgot about that. So when I was knitting the body, I only had it wrapped twice. So once it dried, it was too sloppy and big. So I ripped it out. It was about 4 inches, but it was just plain stockinette, so it didn't faze me too badly. And usually when I rip out yarn, I then soak it in the sink with some wool wash, and then I, roll it up in a towel and step on the towel to get as much water out, and then I let it dry so that it's completely straight again. But I was feeling impatient. So I decided to just try to get it straight with some steam from the steam iron, following a tutorial on the Tech Knitting blog. I'll link to it. That's a great blog, by the way, if you haven't found it. And so I was doing that, and then I got tired of holding the iron. My shoulders have been acting up lately, and so I couldn't hold the iron anymore, and I decided it was good enough. So I just started knitting with it again. And so you'll be able to see why you should probably take the time to let your yarn dry, even though you can feel impatient, because let's see, the best spot is probably right in the middle. Okay, so this down here is short rows that I did with regular yarn, and then this is the reknit yarn, and see how that's uneven? That's because the yarn wasn't quite straight. So pretty sure to block out. If it doesn't block out, we're going to have some problems. I was actually going to block it a couple days ago and find out, but I wanted it dry to show you guys. Okay, so once I got that hiccup out of the way, I started knitting again, and I'm on a new medicine, and it gave me insomnia for a few nights. I'm working on it now, and my doctors shared me some ways to help that, so it's getting better. But for about 3 nights, I did not fall asleep till like 5 to 6 in the morning. It was terrible. And the only good thing to come out of it is that I had quite a few hours to just knit. So here is what I have on my Thistle Down sweater. Basically, from here all the way up. I have done all of the body and half of the neckband, and I actually have done a couple more inches of knitting stockinette, but I had to rip that back too because I had done one of my math things wrong. Anyway, so basically I'm using an Alice Starmore sweater pattern. I told you my shoulders are acting up, so we'll see how long I can hold it. An Alice Starmore pattern for her Elizabeth I sweater, which has the beautiful curved hem with the short rows, and then it has this lovely triangle on the front and back panel that kind of grows out of the stockinette, and it's got these fun little waist darts as well. And then her sweater has a different cable, but in that same book, which is Tudor Roses, the newer edition, she has a pattern for another sweater that has this fabulous Thistle cable, and of course I was going to include that. It was almost the same width as the one in the original pattern, so it was a really easy substitution. And then I had to rework most of the math because this is a sport weight yarn. It is Blue Moon Fiber Arts Blueface Luster BFL Sport. It's not superwash, it's just regular wool, and it's in their Rose City colorway, and I love it, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So with the different gauge, I just had to rework the math, and so the reason why I ended up having to rip back a couple inches of stockinette is because I'd worked out how long this panel was going to be, so I knew how much of the body I needed to work before starting the panel, but I was thinking, when I did that math, I was thinking, okay, I want a 20-inch sweater, but of course that's 20 inches at the shoulder, not the neckline, so I needed to start it a couple inches earlier than I thought. So that's why I had to do a little more ripping, but I love plain stockinette, and this yarn is so wonderful to knit with, so I did not mind at all that I've done about 6 more inches of stockinette than I needed to. And so it has a raglan shaping. The pattern is written flat and seamed, but I don't see the point of knitting a raglan sweater flat and seaming it, especially this is 100% wool, and so it's going to be able to hold its own structure perfectly fine. I've got pretty broad shoulders, so they'll be able to do that. Anyway, so I'm knitting it in the round, but I'm not quite sure if I'm going to have enough yarn to do full-length sleeves or 3/4 length sleeves. So I decided to knit the entire body first. So what I did was for each sleeve, I just did a provisional cast on, and then I did about 6 rows of the bicep, and then I incorporated it into the sweater, and then I'll just do this and knit down and see how the yarn goes. It's still touch and go for me. I can't quite tell yet whether I'll have enough for 3/4 or full-length sleeves. But before I knit the neckband, I tried it on, and I really love how it's fitting. And the neckband is the same, there we go, the same texture as down here. So it's that same band. And then the sleeves have that too. The pattern calls for bell sleeves, but I'm just going to do fitted sleeves because I think that'll look better. And I did the sleeves in the same double moss stitch that you see in the background here, just because why not? I like texture. And this sweater is the same on the front and the back. And usually I like to have my back neckline come up quite far. I use short row shaping for that. But this is a really wide ballet style neckline, and so I thought it would look more elegant if I followed her pattern. And I think it'll look intentional rather than just as if the back is too short. So yeah, I have really, really enjoyed knitting this. The stockinette was just very nice to knit while I was reading, and then once I started these cables, I couldn't wait to watch them grow. The way the triangle is done, it's done in a way that's very easy to memorize and very fun, and it's very easy to track your knitting. So this is my first Alice Starmore pattern, and I think she has a reputation for being really complicated, and some of the other patterns in that book certainly are. But this has definitely made me want to knit more by her. And as you can tell, I get really into sweater knitting. They tend to occupy most of my knitting space once I cast one on. That's why I hadn't cast this on when I had a bunch of Christmas knitting left to do. So, those are all my works in progress and my finished objects. So now we can get on to the topic. So this week I am going to talk about yarn, and that is thanks to Mimi MC, who joined the Ravelry group. Thanks so much, and left a question. I really love it when people leave questions in the Ravelry group and chat with me and share your projects. So if you have the time and inclination, that would be fabulous, but no pressure, of course. And really quickly, I wanted to thank Kyla, who is Knockout Kyla on Ravelry, for last week's question about sweater knitting, because I couldn't remember her name. I'm sorry. So, okay. So Mimi MC wanted to know how I choose my yarns, how I found my favorites, how I developed my knowledge of yarns, and I especially liked the last bit, which was how I figured out these likes and dislikes without buying and sampling every yarn ever, or maybe I did. No, I certainly do not have an unlimited yarn budget, and I have not sampled every yarn out there. So the easiest question is how I developed my yarn knowledge. I am a big fan of Clara Parks' books. She has the Knitter's Book of Yarn, the Knitter's Book of Wool, and the Knitter's Book of Socks, all of which go into a lot of detail about different characteristics to look for in fibers and yarn, and all the different things that can affect them, and what kind of knitting projects they're best in, and how you can adapt a knitting project to use a certain kind of yarn. I got them from my library, so I cannot show them to you now, but they're beautiful books as well. So, yeah, that's my resource. I also watched a free Craftsy class on breed-specific yarns that I will link to. It's not by Clara Parks, it's by Deborah Robinson, perhaps? She wrote the Fleece and Fiber source book, which I have also gotten from my library. That one I think will be more useful if I ever get into spinning. So once I'd read those books, and I actually read Clara Parks' first book before I could even learn to knit, because I saw it in the new section of my library and it was so pretty. And I was a wool fan for years before I learned how to knit. I would thrift wool sweaters. My entire closet is thrifted. I didn't have much money at all for most of my 20s, and so that was the only way for me to clothe myself, but it also let me have much more high quality clothes. So I could thrift, like nice wool sweaters for $3 or $4, because I never lived in one of the hipster areas where the thrifting is trendy. So, once I'd read Clara Parks, I really wanted to try breed-specific yarns, and I knew that I wanted to try out woolen versus worsted spun, and that I also wanted the yarn to be as natural as possible. So you won't see me using a lot of superwash. I do use some sock yarns that are superwash, because I find it very difficult to find non-superwash sock weight yarns that are tightly spun and aren't merino, which would be best for socks. So I love the quince finch, which I found very durable for socks, but it knits up at a slightly looser gauge. Like I do 7 to 7.5 stitches an inch, and that gives me a really nice tight sturdy fabric, but that means that since I also have small feet, some sock patterns I can't knit with that yarn. Anyway, sorry, I'm going way off topic. We can talk about sock yarn another time. So when I first started buying yarn, I only bought what was at my local yarn store, because I really wanted to support them and I wanted to be able to buy the yarn in person, but they didn't carry a lot of the more local or more breed-specific yarn. So then I started switching to buying online, and I use Ravelry D-Stash quite a bit, and then I also am a huge fan of color cards for buying online. So here's my little quince book, and these are great because you don't have to guess, or try to look at 700 photos of finished objects on Ravelry and decide whether the color, trying to mentally change the white balance all the time. So you can just see them all. And yeah, and I have found them a very worthy investment. And the nice thing too about color cards is that you can get a sense of the textures. So this shows all of Quince's wool line, which are all made from the same wool fiber, but spun in different ways to get different results. And so you can kind of get a sense of the different possibilities there. And so that's one way to at least get exposed to different yarns if you don't have a really extensive local yarn store available to you and you don't have a ton of money to spend on all these different skeins. The Quince color card is a little pricey. I think it was $18 for all of them with shipping, but other ones are quite cheaper. So if you're interested in worsted spun yarn, Beaver Slide is a great company. They're American, and my first sweater was knit out of them. And so I think this cost me $4, and it's got all the colors for their 2-ply sock yarn, which they call it sock yarn because it's a fingering weight, but I would not use this for socks because it's quite loosely plied. So yeah, very reasonable, including shipping. And then if you really want to have fun, there's a company called Blackberry Ridge. I've not ordered any of their yarn before, but they offer samples of all the colors of all their yarns, and they are a mill as well as a dyer, so they've got quite a few different lines, and for like I think $8 including shipping, all of this came in the mail. And a lot of them came in loose, so I put them on index cards, but this is all of the yarn that you will get. So yeah, pretty much you can compare all kinds of different textures, and what's cool is a lot of their yarn uses the same wool base, and then they add silk or lace or alpaca, or they spin it different ways, or some of it's been superwashed. And so it's very easy to compare and contrast, right? I mean, you can't knit with the samples, they're not that big, but you can certainly start to get a little bit of knowledge. I mean, look at all that. That's crazy, right? So I did all that, and then for me, I'm going to talk about sock yarns in a different episode because I did go on a very deliberate idea. But with sweater yarns, I prefer lighter weight, so I knew that I wanted to mainly do fingering weight, and now I'm trying a sport weight for the first time, and I'll report back on that later. But so since I'm still kind of in the experimental phase, I mainly used Ravelry D-Stash because I can get some really good deals there, and since there's so many different yarns to try, even ones that meet my ethical criteria and my color criteria, so when I do it on D-Stash, it kind of, you know, it makes it a lot easier because then there's the element of chance. Oh, this yarn is in a color I want, and it's in a sweater quantity, and it's at a great price, so I guess I'll try this next. So that has worked really well for me. And I guess I would call that kind of slow sampling, you know. One sweater at a time, learning more about my dislikes and likes. And for me as well, so in Barry Schwartz's, he wrote this book called Paradox of Choice, talking about how in the modern developed world, we live in a kind of consumerist society, and there's like a million options for everything, and looking at whether that actually helps people or not. And he talks about how there are two kinds of ways you can make a choice. You can either be a satisfier, and that is when, you know, you lay out your criteria and you look at your options, and the first one that meets all your criteria, you're good. And then there are the maximizers who want to know every single possible option and evaluate every single one of them before they decide. I tend to be a satisfier. So once I find a company that I like, for instance Quince, I have had nothing but good experiences with all of their yarns. And so I use their yarns a lot because they meet every criteria that I want. They are affordable for me. Now I say that, they're affordable for me, but it's still a luxury. So I'm very grateful that I have enough fun money now. For most of my 20s, I had pretty much no fun money, so it's a good thing I wasn't a knitter. I wouldn't have been able to knit. I tried unraveling sweaters when I first started knitting, but it never worked for me, thrifted sweaters. Anyway, so, you know, now I use a lot of quince. As I said, Beaver Slide, I really liked their yarn that I knit with, and so I'm sure I'll use them for future projects. Elsa Wool, which is Cormo yarn. I love her stuff. So for me, it's not a matter of trying every single yarn that's out there. It's a matter of finding companies that sell yarn that fits the kinds of projects I want to make, and once I found ones, just being a repeat purchaser with them. I'm going to have to do a quick transition, and then I'll talk a little more about this. As I was saying, my goal when I'm trying new yarns is not to try every yarn that's out there. Instead, it's to find ones that will make great future socks, future sweaters, and then just buy it in all the colors I like and knit with it, and we're good. So, that's why I end up using so many quince yarns. Plus, they have quite a few different ones, so I've tried several of them for the first time this year. But also, in addition to wanting to make finished objects that I'm going to wear, I like to try different breed-specific wools. So far I've tried, well, Merino, obviously, and then Cormo, Shetland. This Blue-Faced Leicester is the first regular Blue-Faced Leicester that I've tried. I do have a couple socks out of Superwash BFL. And next year I'm thinking about trying Polworth. So that's something that I kind of prioritize. When I'm buying sweater quantities, I think about what sweaters I want to wear. And as I think I said, I spent most of my 20s with almost no fun money, so all of my clothes are thrifted because that's all I could afford, but it also means that I got some really nice quality stuff that, you know, like for $3 or $4 you can either get an acrylic sweater or a wool sweater. So I have quite a few wool sweaters already, and so I want to make sure that I'm not knitting duplicates and that kind of thing. So I'll just talk about my latest stash acquisition, and the last one you'll see for a while, because the only yarn I plan on ordering for the next few months is for like presents for people, is Canopy Fingering in the Sarsaparilla colorway. I'm gonna focus. Which is a beautiful brown, and it's a dark, cool brown, and it's got some purple undertones to it. And the reason why I decided that this would be a good addition is because my sweater stash right now, I've only got one, well, I don't actually have any other quantities of fingering weight sweaters, and I really like my fingering sweaters. So I knew that this would be a good buy for that reason. I also, brown works really well in my fall and winter wardrobe. The colors I wear tend to work really well with cool browns, and I tend to reach a lot more for browns than I do in the summer. So this made sense in that sense. Also, I've been wanting to do a kind of very feminine, vintage-inspired pullover with like a Peter Pan collar, maybe a sailor collar, I don't know, something kind of frilly. And when I'm doing frilly things, I like to do them in more neutral yarn colors. So I knew this would be perfect for that. And after using, so this is by the Fiber Company, and after trying out their Road to China Light, which is a luxury sport weight yarn that I used for that shawl, I really fell in love with the way that yarn was balanced and spun and dyed. And so I wanted to have more of the Fiber Company in my life. So, and this is a 50% alpaca, 30% merino, 20% bamboo. And I also wanted a dressy jumper, and I knew that this would read as fairly dressy because of that fiber content. So So that's the kinds of things that go through my head when I'm looking to add to stash. Socks are a bit of an exception, but for sweater quantities, which are where I'm putting, sweater quantity of yarn is not cheap. Considering I'm used to thrifting sweaters for like $4. It took me a while to be able to knit my first sweater because I just didn't want to put that much money into it. And this, I would say, and this was actually, it's 1,600 yards, it's 8 skeins, so I'll be able to knit a pair of gloves and perhaps even a hat as well as the jumper, because for me, fingering weight sweaters take 900 to 1,200 yards in the past. So I hope that you enjoyed hearing me ramble a bit about how I've tried different yarns and found my favorites. I would definitely recommend Claire Parks as a great resource if you're interested in learning more about different yarn characteristics. That would be, that's what I actually started reading her books before I was knitting, and it's part of what inspired me to learn to knit because it just seemed like such fun. I have yet to be disappointed by any of the breed-specific wools I've tried. I tend to stick to the one she describes as softer because although I'm not super sensitive to wool, I can wear regular wool. I know my mother can't wear pretty much any wool, so I'm not that level, but I also don't like being itchy. So some of the more sturdy, I guess, yarns definitely itch me, or my swan jumper that I have to wear a t-shirt under. So that's why I've stuck to the softer breed specific ones, because especially since from my budget perspective, every sweater that I hand knit is a gigantic luxurious treat to myself, and so I want to feel like I'm in a little warm woolly hug. And I just feel very fortunate that with Cormo and Blueface Leicester and the Quince yarns, they're not breed specific, but they're different kinds, that I am able to have access to this wonderfully made, high quality, reasonably priced for a luxury. So let me know what your favorite yarn companies are and which ones you would recommend trying, and whether you also enjoy doing breed specific yarns and all that kind of stuff. I will start a thread for this episode as always, and the Ravelry group is nice and small, which means it's really easy to get to know people and it's not overwhelming for, introverts like myself. And now I'm starting to ramble, so I think I will let you guys go. I hope that you had a lovely weekend, and I will see you guys next week. Bye!